Morning, friends. Today, I would like to touch upon a topic on which I conducted more training programs than on any other subject in banking as faculty at a leading commercial bank, namely risk management. So, let's see how we can assess risk in the present conditions of conflict, war, economic instability, and geopolitical conflict, which is termed as polycrisis risk. A combination of geopolitical conflict, economic fragmentation, and political uncertainty, the current situation. The US Israel Iran war spreading into the rest of the Middle East can be assessed through three interconnected lenses: energy security, financial stability, and labor mobility. Let's break this down into a more structured way. The energy and supply chain shock. This has been the primary trigger. This ongoing conflict in Iran and disruption in the Strait of Hormuz, which carries about 20% of global oil, is seen as the biggest systemic risk. Oil prices have already crossed $100 and could spike to 150 to 170 in worst cases. This feeds directly into inflation of fuel, transport, food, fertilizers, manufacturing costs, and reduced global trade growth. Institutions like World Trade Organizations and the Bank for International Settlement are flagging stagflation risk, that is, low growth and high inflation. Financial markets and macroeconomic risk is the second one. The global stock markets have already declined and capital is becoming more risk averse. Rising oil prices have shot up the higher, resulting in higher interest rates, tighter liquidity, and slow hiring in many sectors. A prolonged conflict should have a global GDP, should shave off a global GDP growth and trigger recession conditions. Unlike past wars, today's hyper-connected financial system amplifies shocks instantly. The third is a political risk, the policy unpredictability. The US political indecisiveness that impacts most other nations, particularly India, is a major factor. Uncertainty in US foreign policy, military escalation versus restraint is increasing volatility. Trade protectionism and shifting alliances are weakening the cohesion of global institutions like WTO, NATO. Businesses now factor in risks such as sanctions risk, regulatory unpredictability, supply chain fragmentation into the price, thereby increasing the prices of goods. This is why political risk insurance and scenario planning are booming industries today. The area to be impacted are employment and livelihood. In the war zones, there is immediate job reduction, in fact, job destruction. Middle East instability has resulted in layoffs in construction, oil and gas services, hospitality industries. And the indirect global job impact is due to high energy costs, which reduces corporate margins, has resulted in freezing of fresh hiring. And the trade disruptions and the resulting in export slowdowns also has contributed to the job losses. The worst hit sectors globally: aviation, logistics, manufacturing where it is energy intensive, then chemicals, fertilizers, agriculture. Recently, I was just reading a report on how earlier this month a hacking group tied to Iranian intelligence walked through a digital door at a certain corporation in US, one of the world's largest medical technology companies, and flipped the lights off. The hackers hit with a full-scale wipe. So the employee devices across multiple regions were erased. Internal systems became dark, collaboration tools, the enterprise infrastructure gone. Almost 200,000 devices were wiped off. And more than a week later, some employees still haven't been able to log in. And since this is a hospital and emergency related service, the medical service providers uh, pause the LifeNet system, the platform that lets paramedics transmit the patient's vital signs to the emergency room before the ambulance arrives. This leads to surgeries being delayed and emergency responses chains fractured. This company that supports about 150 million patients across 61 countries was brought to its knees by the lines of code. Not a single bullet need to be fired. Of course, a particular group in Iran claimed responsibility into Iranian intelligence, framed it as a retaliation for the US military strike in Minab, Iran, one that reportedly hit an elementary school. They shut down the systems that keep people alive on operating tables. And the stock market's response? Cyber security stocks are trading at discounted valuations. So, see the disconnect between what is happening in reality, in the real world, and what the market is pricing in. So, there is a total chaos in the way the situations happen in reality, the events take place in reality, and how market responds, resulting in an economic volatility, resulting in, of course, some people taking advantage or the situation and making fortunes out of it. So the battlefields has already shifted. Modern warfare is very different. It has shifted from physical locations where the kinetic war is being waged right into the hospital, your power grid, your water treatment plant. It comes through the fiber optic cable. Following Israel's military strikes in 2025, cyber attacks targeting Israel surged 700%, according to a cybersecurity firm, Radware. Iran launched what it calls the Great Epic Cyber Campaign, part of a broader ideological framework called the Cyber Islamic Resistance. The Center for Strategic and International Studies has documented these attacks and distributed the denial of service attacks against US banks, election interference campaign, and the exploitation of industrial controlled systems across Israel and into the Persian Gulf. This is a state sponsored digital warfare operating at an industrial scale. And many of these systems run on legacy software, so that vendors no longer can support those systems even if a patch is up. So the even patch cannot be applied. So they're just sitting there waiting. So in December 2024, Iranian hackers caused water overflow and system outages at US water systems by exploiting Israeli made components in municipal water infrastructure. So though you don't need a $13 billion aircraft carrier when a laptop and a zero-day exploit can shut down a city's water supply. So compromise a single software update and they gain access to numerous government data. The playbook is very simple, but it is very effective. Don't attack the castle, attack the company that delivers the food. Since then, large-scale supply chain compromises have nearly quadrupled. Today, digital ecosystems are so interconnected that a single compromised vendor can cascade across entire industries. There are software update mechanisms, third party integrations, every connection point that may be a place of potential entry. And AI powered tools are now enabling these attackers to automate everything and thus identify vulnerabilities in minutes rather than weeks. So, this means that the speed of attack has outpaced the speed of defense. Each of those digital AI agents needs authentication, access permissions, and monitoring. So, every single one is a new attack surface. And when one set of keys is given to a building, and when people are trying to break in through using the same AI tools, they can find a number of other windows open with which they are able to unlock them. So the threat is accelerating faster than most boardrooms or portfolios are prepared for. India specifically, we are facing three structural dependencies. First, obviously, is the energy dependence. 60% oil imports comes from the Gulf region. And the risks involved here are fuel inflation, the fuel costs inflation, current account deficit widening, pressure on the rupee, which has crossed 94 to the dollar. Second is remittances and overseas employment. Remittances almost, which is about $100 billion, remittances annually from the Middle East has been impacted. Job losses for a number of Gulf employed people. It's been estimated that around 220,000 people have already returned. This directly affects household consumption in India and also the rural and semi-urban economies. So the livelihood risk is very high in India with such a large majority of the population, of the middle class population and the lower middle class population in the country. Apart from this, the capital inflow has also faced a major shock. The fertilizer and food security, fertilizers, as we know, come from the Middle East, from which are the major key fertilizer inputs. The disruption there has affected the farm sector, the agricultural sector, and this has resulted in higher food prices. However, we find that the US still acts as the anchor for the global system, but vulnerabilities are rising there. The key high risks are high debt, high interest rates, political polarization affecting the economic decisions, trade protectionism. If US slows down, the IT exports from India decline. Student migration and education flows weaken. And global capital flows also tighten. However, paradoxically, US defense and energy sectors benefit from the conflict. So, the US is both a shock absorber and a shock transmitter. But however, there seems to be a big shift that is underway. What we are seeing is not just a temporary crisis, but a transition into a new global order. From the old model of globalization, if we take the period 1990 to 2020, where stable supply chains had a US led order, we are entering a new emerging model where there are fragmented blocks, US, China, and regional powers, security over efficiency, and frequent geopolitical shocks. The bottom line is, how do we synthesize this risk? For businesses, it is a shift from efficiency to resilience. The current Iran Middle East crisis is not just a regional war, it's a global economic stress test. For India specifically, the biggest concern is not immediate collapse, but a slow squeeze. In fact, we can see in some areas it is an immediate collapse. The rising costs, falling remittances, and uncertain global demand has resulted in has affected manufacturing sectors which are in the areas of auto components, textiles and garments, chemicals and plastics, because these sectors are dependent on exports and are energy intensive. Production is energy intensive, and oil prices rise means there's a cost pressure, and also the reduced demand has also increased the risk. The other areas are aviation, which has affected airline staff, travel agencies, the logistics and tourism, which has also affected shipping and logistic firms. The main reason is fuel costs surge and a drop in travel, which demands fuel because of the fuel uncertainty has almost grounded most of the airlines. Sectors, however, that may not collapse in a stable even in these times of in these volatile times, in times of this war, are the banking and financial services, including the NBFCs, the retail banking, investment analysis roles. These services will be relatively unaffected, although loan defaults may rise during the slowdown. During this period, you may find a large number of cases of loan defaults. Real estate and construction industries may also slow down. Education and foreign study ecosystem, because of the visa uncertainty, students may defer expensive education. The most resilient or safe careers during this period would be those that are relatively protected and may even grow in future are energy and core resources such as oil and gas, especially domestic, renewable energies, solar, the EV ecosystem. It is safe because energy becomes strategic, and governments should invest more. And the government and public sector areas such as civil services, PSU jobs, defense sector are also less affected by global shocks because of increased government spending in these areas. Healthcare and pharmaceuticals, where we find employment of doctors, nurses, medical supply chains may also find a increasing demand because demand is non-cyclical and India is a global pharmaceutical hub. High-end technological services such as AI, machine learning, cyber security, cloud infrastructure, because these are strategic technological spending and it continues even in downturns. Cyber risks cannot be avoided. It will only increase during such geopolitical tensions. Another area is agriculture and food supply chain, such as agricultural business, food processing, fertilizer and supply chain roles, because these become critical. And in fact, government support increases in these areas, so these are relatively less affected. But even in these kind of tense times, turbulent times, emerging opportunity areas are there in areas such as defense and security industry, both manufacturing, surveillance, cyber security, supply chain and allocation, including warehousing, the domestic manufacturing, logistics. And of course, where analytics and risk management compliance is required, such as for analyzing the political risk involved, the ESC and regulatory financial risk, all these modeling will require proper assessment and correct evaluation and provision also during these times. Now, is Indian governance geared up for all this? Can say India is not unprepared, but it is not fully insulated either. We have a mix of buffer building plus crisis management plus gradual structural shifts. The energy risk management, it is our biggest vulnerability. Diversifying the oil imports, not just Middle East, Russia, US, Africa, but maintaining petroleum reserves would be an option. Expanding renewables, solar, green hydrogen push will help. This reduces risk but does not eliminate our dependence on the Gulf. That's still a major contributor. As far as macroeconomic economic buffers are concerned, RBI is doing RBI and the government are focused on stability. They manage inflation with interest rates, managing the foreign exchange reserves, although it has considerably reduced now. Controlling the fiscal deficit with some flexibility. Now, recently, we have the government has allocated a fund of 1 lakh crores, but then this is too late in the day. But it is in anticipation of further deterioration in the economy because considering the shock absorption capacity for short-term crisis, this may be a stopgap arrangement. But foreign policy balancing is the critical aspect we need to strengthen. But Indian diplomacy has had a good history. It's one of our biggest advantages. Our strategy should be to maintain ties with our alliances such as US for technology and trade, Middle East for energy, remittances via employment, and Russia for discounted oil. Avoiding Another strategy would be to avoid hard alignment in conflicts. So, this multi alignment reduces the geopolitical risk exposure. We have a number of welfare schemes and safety nets for social protection, free food grain schemes, direct benefit transfers, rural employment programs. Of course, these prevent extreme poverty spikes, but they don't fully protect the urban middle class or skilled workers. The supply chain and manufacturing push, such as the Make in India program, production linked incentive, it's aimed at reducing the import dependence and create jobs domestically. But that seems to be still in the takeoff stage. Where the Indian governance is still vulnerable is in the employment structure weaknesses. We have a high informal sector of 80% to 90% workforce. Limited social security. People lose income quickly. In fact, they live on daily wages. So recovery is uneven. We have an overdependence on oil imports, remittances from the Middle East, and the income from IT exports to US. These are all externally controlled variables. So definitely we are facing a real shock. Urban job fragility. We do not have a strong unemployment insurance. The economy workers are highly exposed. There is also skill mismatch. Although efforts have been done a lot to upgrade the skills, but many workers cannot easily shift between sectors. This becomes critical during return migration or layoffs abroad in such conditions. So, what actionable steps are needed at the policy level? What should be done to prevent a serious disruption is energy security. Urgent. It is non negotiable. Expand strategic oil reserves, cover at least for 90 to 120 days. Accelerate renewable energy plus storage, not just capacity, but reliability. Secure long term oil contracts with multiple countries. The goal is to reduce our vulnerability to Middle East shocks. Because even if services are restored, still a lot of damage has been done. And even restoration of that damage will take quite some time. Then we have this urban unemployment guarantee program, like the rural, the Manrega, which is, but for this, which has been recently renamed, to incentivize labor intensive industries in like the textile industries, food processing, electronic assembly. We don't have much incentives for these areas. Strengthening the domestic demand, tax relief on or income support for middle class during inflation spikes, boost the rural income like the MSP, agricultural reforms, infrastructure, and supply chain localization, reduce dependency on volatile regions. RBI could take actions for ensuring liquidity in the banking system, monitor the NBFC risks, prevent credit crunch, avoid the domino effect of business failures. And for those migrated or the re-entry of workforce from abroad, they should be, we need to create a database of these returning workers so that we can fast track their absorption into either infrastructure projects or any other ongoing manufacturing zones, so that we can turn a crisis into a workforce opportunity. Inflation is the fastest way to hurt livelihoods. So, what, as far as that's going to affect all of us, so what should individuals and business expect? So, even if there is good governance, there will likely be slow growth. It may not be a collapse, but some sectors will shrink while others may expand. Income inequality may rise temporarily. The role of governance is to prevent a systemic collapse. It may not be able to eliminate the pain that we are undergoing on a mass scale. Even with the hotels closing down and the prices rising, even of ordinary cup of tea and a daily breakfast dish. But it can help in preventing the systemic collapse, ensure faster recovery. India has is in a better position in the sense that we have a strong, aware population in tune with the national and international conditions. That is, a lot of awake individuals who are resilient and have the capacity to adapt. But the real test is not in surviving the crisis, it is how quickly India can adapt structurally. So, to avoid a devastating situation, disaster situation, three things matter most. One is energy interdependence or at least resilience, independence or at least resilience, mass employment generation, especially urban, reducing the dependence on any single geographical area, that is US or the Middle East. If these are handled well, India doesn't just survive, it can actually emerge stronger from this global instability. Has political incompetence affected our country's position? Our economy influences politics and often has domain experts who have the potential to steer things around in times of crisis. That is why, in spite of political bankruptcy and in spite of everything being done to stifle, control, regulate, constrict, and diminish the growth, Indians thrive because we are made that way. And India being a karma bhumi, karma plays a huge role in upsetting, resetting, and course correcting wherever necessary. Where the governance has worked well in India is macroeconomic stability. That is, RBI intervention prevented currency free fall, even though the present situation is just unbelievable. Inflation was well managed until recently. Infrastructure push, the government has been spending a lot on this area. It has prevented slowdown despite global weaknesses. And still, even though the foreign policy has not been consistent, we have had access to Russian oil, Middle East. In the Middle East, we have still managed the relations and the Western markets. But where the gaps are really visible are still the heavy dependence on imported oil and the long-term policy gap. There's a delayed response to inflation risk and also a weak communication as against expectations from management. Markets will react strongly when policy direction is unclear. The global risks are not proactively addressed. It's allowed to stagnate or response stagnates. This affects investor confidence. Over reliance on few growth engines like IT exports and remittances, not diversified enough yet. The current stress is less about incompetence and more about structural exposure. Even a highly efficient government could face all this. The attack destroyed a significant portion of the world's largest liquefied natural gas facility, which accounted for almost 17% of the global LNG supply. In fact, the repairs are estimated to take 3 to 5 years. Qatar Energy has declared force majeure on long term contracts, even with nations like Italy, Belgium, South Korea, and China. The economic impact, the facility's outage represents an estimated $20 billion annual revenue loss and poses a severe threat to global industrial production and electricity generation. The strikes were a direct retaliation for a previous Israeli attack on South Pars, the Iranian side of the shared gas field. This incident marks a dangerous escalation in the Middle East conflict, affecting infrastructure that served as a cornerstone of global energy security. The Europe's backup plan, built over 3 years to replace Russian gas, has equally been nullified by the disruption to its alternative supply chain. As per Goldman Sachs projects that if projection, if the flows through the Strait of Hormuz remain low for 60 days, the Brent crude would likely exceed $147.50 per barrel, breaking the all-time record set in 2008. Even in a modern scenario, oil is projected to remain around $111 per barrel. at the end of 2027, which means a triple digit prices could persist for another 2 3 years. American gas prices have already increased by more than 3.91 per gallon, the highest since October 2022, marking an increase of about $11 per gallon in just 3 weeks. So the significance lies in the physical nature of the damage. It's not a political decision that can be reversed, but requires another 3 to 5 years to repair the damage on the engineering realities of the region. Fertilizer is manufactured from natural gas. When oil prices increases, it drives up the natural gas prices, causing fertilizer prices to follow. So this will result in a delay of 3 to 6 months of supply. Another event that happened was an Iranian frigate, the Iris Dana, was torpedoed, a commercial tanker in the Indian Ocean. This challenges the recent American assessment that the Iranian Navy had been eliminated and highlights a critical gap between Western intelligence and Iranian operational capabilities. Now, this Iris Dana is a conventional Navy vessel, not part of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGCN Corps Navy. Fast attack craft that was previously degraded by US forces in the Persian Gulf. It was pre-positioned in the Indian Ocean weeks before the conflict began. Now, the attack occurred 3,500 miles from Iran in the Indian Ocean. This demonstrates that the shipping route previously considered safe, which is an alternative workaround to the closed Strait of Hormuz, is now under direct threat. So, what are the by threatening shipping in the Red Sea, Persian Gulf, and now the Indian Ocean, Iran has effectively closed a major maritime routes, removing the ceiling on oil price escalation. Traders are adjusting models to account for potential oil prices reaching $150 to $200 per barrel. This development puts an immense pressure on India, as the attack has occurred in its strategic backyard and complicates the ceasefire negotiations, which were previously focused only on the Persian Gulf. Iran was able to operate past US naval elimination because the American military action targeted the wrong force. Iran's operational planning and pre-positioning of these conventional naval assets in the Indian Ocean were done months before. And now there is a theory that it was anticipating a conflict that the US assessed. But these attacks impacts the global electronics because South Korea, a major supplier to the global electronic supply chain, relies on energy transiting the Indian Ocean to power its semiconductor manufacturing. The torpedo attack makes the Indian Ocean routes unsafe, threatening the energy supply necessary for producing South Korean components. So there seems to be a violation of sphere of interest. The Iranian frigate operation occurred within India's primary sphere of strategic interest without India's consent. India must navigate a difficult diplomatic calculation due to its existing relationships with both Iran and the United States. India is identified as the only major power that has the capability in the immediate vicinity to respond directly to the threat, as its navy and maritime patrol aircraft are already ready to operate in those waters. To execute the attack, the frigate either stationed itself in the area in advance based on knowledge of shipping routes or used maritime surveillance capable to maneuver into a fringe position of 2 to 20 kilometers from the tanker. This event highlights a critical gap in intelligence collection. The operation implies Iranian possesses surveillance capabilities in the Indian Ocean that have largely gone undetected by Allied naval forces. Conventional naval deployment in the Indian Ocean are planned and provisioned on timelines measured in months in advance, indicating that the frigate was placed in position weeks or months before the conflict began. So, anticipating the necessity to threaten alternative shipping routes. The torpedo attack of Sri Lanka creates a dilemma for China also, by forcing its public diplomatic position, calling for restraint and supporting a ceasefire into direct tension with its commercial interests. Chinese flagged vessels rely on these Indian Ocean sea lanes for energy imports and exports. An Iranian torpedo attack on a commercial vessel in those waters acts as an attack on the maritime infrastructure of China's own global trade. So, consequently, China cannot publicly endorse these conventional naval operations without endorsing attacks on its own commercial shipping dependencies. So, previously, global markets and shipping companies had used the Indian Ocean transit route as a viable workaround because it was assessed as safe from Iranian naval threats, allowing supply to move and capping price escalation. By demonstrating the ability to target vessels in this specific alternative corridor, this iris dana show that no safe route remains, invalidating the previous price stability model. So there appears to be a general loss of trust and alliances, which has damaged relationships with long standing allies. The military engagement with Iran as lacking clear strategy, driven by impulsive decisions rather than planning. This situation is causing oil prices to rise and upsetting allies. Israel appears to be driving the strategy, putting the United States in the co pilot seat. So, how do we handle the provisions of risk management under such volatile geopolitical circumstances that has affected each and every one on the planet? As far as banks are concerned, we have the Basel III recommendations issued by the Bank for International Settlement, BIS. The first is strengthening the capital requirements, which ensures higher quality capital, that is emphasized on the common tier 1 capital as the highest quality capital, which includes equity shares and retained earnings, deductions from for non-tangible assets. Then minimum capital ratios are required to be maintained as 4.5% of risk-weighted assets, and the tier 1 capital should be a minimum of 6%. The total of Tier 1 and Tier 2 capital should be minimum 8%. Capital conservation buffer, an addition of 2.5% is stipulated on risk weighted assets for the CET1, which ensures that the banks can build reserves in for good times, which right now we had to provide for 1 lakh crore fund. So, if this buffer would have been maintained, that would have averted that. Counter cyclical buffer, another 2.5% extra capital activated during excessive credit growth is there. This is also can be provided. The purpose is to reduce pro-cyclicality and protect the banks during downturns such as these times. Then a leverage ratio, the non-risk based control ratio, that is 3% leverage ratio is calculated at Tier 1 capital divided by the total exposure. This should not be greater than or equal to 3%. So this acts as a backstop to risk-based capital measures. So this prevents, when this is maintained as capital, it limits excessive borrowings and balance sheet expansion. So there won't be excess of debt. So that is to a certain extent restricted. So what now we are scrambling with high debt and then interest suffering due to interest on that debt, which is for which we are borrowing again. That can be restricted if this higher capital provision is maintained. Then there are two liquidity ratios which banks must hold: a high quality liquidity ratio, which is enough to survive for 30 days stress, and requirement is LCR, that is should be greater than or equal to 100%. Then net stable funding ratio. So it ensures a long-term stability. You don't collapse in a year's time. So there's a 1-year horizon requirement of stable funding upon required funding, which should be more than 100%. The purpose is to prevent liquidity crisis such as those which we saw in 2008 in the US when several banks collapsed. So this at Basel III, the coverage, there's an expanded coverage of risks, which is counterparty credit risk, especially the derivatives, credit valuation adjustment risk, securitization risk, and off balance sheet exposures. So this also promotes central clearing of derivatives and better measurement of exposures. For where the banks which are systemically important banks, which are systemically important, where government accounts are maintained, or where there are transfers between countries, where the nostro accounts, vostro accounts are maintained. For such account, extra buffers should be maintained to reduce systemic risk. The objective is to prevent collapse of too big to fail institutions. Still, for improving the risk management and governance, there is a second pillar known as supervisory review. Now, this supervisory review, it has been made stronger. And the third pillar is disclosure requirements. There is improved transparency so that market discipline is observed. The stakeholders know what is going on in the bank as well as the companies. Encourages better internal risk models and strong governance practices. So these Basel III norms has been devised to encourage banks to build capital in economic booms and use the buffers in downturns. So it stabilizes the financial system across all kinds of cycles. Then it has also made provision for stress testing and macro prudential focus. Stress testing, this can be devised by the banks themselves and focuses on system-wide risks. So the Basel III reforms, certain additional refinements include standardized approach for credit and operational risk. The output flow, that is internal model benefits, the banks can devise their own internal models, and risk revised leverage and risk calculation methods. They can use their own leverage, that is 10%, 15%. They can alter the weightages. Ultimately, it creates a more resilient global banking system. Now, here at this point, I would like to go a little bit deeper onto this operational risk under Basel III. Because operational risk is often put against or argued against the cost of opportunity lost. So people who want to make money in the short term want to weigh it against the cost of opportunity lost as against operational risk. So there is no provision made for operational risk. So under the risk calculation method in Basel III, there has been a major shift in the final reforms. Operational risk is defined by the Bank for International Settlements as the risk of loss resulting from inadequate or failed internal processes, people, systems, or from external events. For example, frauds, cyber attacks like what we see in this war times, IT system failures, power losses, process errors, legal risks, that is fines or penalties, natural disasters, which we have seen recently in the Qatar example, natural disasters disrupting operations. So but it excludes, however, strategic risk and reputation risk, though they may be indirectly impacted. When these risks are more in an organization, it will naturally affect the reputation of that organization. This operational risk methods have been evolving. Now we have had Basel 1, Basel 2, now it's Basel 3. But Basel 3 replaces all of those earlier methods. Earlier, we had the basic indicator approach where we used to provide for operational risk 15% of the average gross income of the last 3 years. That is, net profit of the last 3 years taken, or a gross income taken over the past 3 years after minusing certain losses. You provide, take the average of that and provide 15% on that. The standardized approach is different business lines assigned fixed risk percentages. Now, standardized approach, the business line will be like, for example, for corporate finance, 18% factor may be fixed. Trading and sales may be 18%. Retail banking may be fixed at 12%. Commercial banking at 15%. So these are different risk weightages that are assigned. And then you arrive at a risk percentage. For in the advanced measurement approach, the banks can use internal models based on the loss data, that is losses that the bank has occurred over a period, like the NPAs and the amounts written off and in which sectors they are, scenario analysis, which industries they have faced major losses, the risk indicators. So all these internal models the banks can develop for better resilience. But Basel III has introduced a single unified method, and that is the standardized measurement approach. The operational risk capital is based on, in the step one, in arriving at the measurement, the standardized measurement for operational risk capital. What's the quantum of the operational risk the capital required? First, you arrive at the basic indicator. This basic indicator is equal to interest plus lease plus dividend component plus service component plus financial component. The step 2 will be business indicator component. The business indicator component, you give it according to the quantum of finance. So up to 1 billion, it will be 12%, a coefficient or a weightage of 12%. For 1 to 30 billion, 15%. Above 30 billion, 18%. The larger banks can provide for higher capital, will require a higher capital. Then the step 3 involves internal loss multiplier. So this is based on the historical losses of the banks. If losses are high, then the internal loss multiplier is greater than 1, which means that it will require a higher capital. And if losses are, if ILM is equal to 1, then the same, if it will be the same amount of capital. So ultimately, after arriving all these step 1, step 2, step 3, the capital requirement will be, that is for operational risk, the capital will be the BIC multiplied by ILM. That is business indicator component multiplied by the ILM. That is internal loss multiplier. That it is a component function, that is a particular this number. So practical interpretation. So when we this is a complicated formula by which we arrive at the amount of capital that has to be set aside and invested in equity or safe investments by a bank or a commercial or any financial institution. Which are set aside. So what does it imply for a bank? It means that a large bank which has poor controls, there's a lot of cyber attacks, a lot of leaks, a lot of loss, it will require a high level of capital. A large bank with strong controls may require moderate capital, and a small bank can manage with lower capital. So, under Basel, for operational risk, the categories of risks that have been arrived at are internal fraud, external fraud, which is huge in India, employment practices, the client's products and business practices, damage to physical assets. Excuse me. So these 7 types of risks are internal fraud, external fraud, employment practices, clients, products and business practices, damage to physical assets that has happened right now, business disruption and systemic failures, execution, delivery and process management. These are the 7 categories that has been identified by BIS, Bank for International Settlements. So from a leadership point of view, as leaders, how are you going to provide for this kind of geopolitical risk in terms of operational risk? In fact, if I may give a tiny insight, all this trade, the tariffs, the tariffs which is being levied by the US to all countries for all the trade due to their debt has been a result of this awareness or lack of awareness of this operational risk. People have been investing in stock markets, and they have been making money, raising the prices of stocks and shares in the market with no qualms, with no provisions for operational risk. That is, the entire profit is reinvested and um, whether it is individuals or even the service providers or the non-banking financial companies or even the traders, without providing for this operational risk. And if any amount is falls short, as naturally even overnight there could be margin loss of margin. So then you borrow. So this has been the practice of borrowing to replenish the loss and still trying to make a profit by raising the prices of the stocks in the market. So this has resulted in the rise in debt, and which was interpreted by Trump as because of disadvantageous position of US in terms of trade, resulting in the increase in their debts. But it's not entirely it was driven by trade only, physical trade. It is also market driven, where funds have flowed from other countries, from the stock markets, and raised the prices of the shares and stocks in the US markets, resulting in the huge flow of funds from market to market to take advantage of the price differentials and make a quick buck in the process. So there is this operational risk has been totally neglected, or you can say bypassed. No provision has been made. At least a certain the purpose of providing for operational risk is of 15% of the average profit of the last 3 years. Whether it is for banks, even individuals have to follow the same thing. That means out of the profits of trades also, a certain 15% has to be provided, set aside for operational risk. The argument is the opportunity cost lost for not investing. Means the opportunity, the profit of losing the opportunity cost. So they measure in terms of costs, but you don't measure the terms of risk. So that is where the Basel III has redefined operational risk and brought about a clarity of the process. So it in this times of this chaotic situation that the whole world is in right now, this becomes very important. And the human consciousness, the awareness of what we are faced with, what we are handed or where we have landed ourselves in, is because of a total lack of integrity. That is, we have over traded, over involved, and just to make money out of greed for money, with total lack of logical thinking and non-provision for these operational risks. So operational risk is misalignment between intent, process, and execution. So, having a proper geopolitical risk assessment and how we can mitigate it in alignment with the Basel III principles, we have certain, at least as far as the banking context is concerned, let us summarize it in this way. The geopolitical risk means risk involved due to political instability, conflicts, sanctions, trade restrictions, policy shifts that affect the financial systems, and cross-border exposures. So these can arise from wars, economic sanctions, trade wars, regime changes, sovereign defaults, resource nationalism, all these things. So the regulatory expectation would be there cannot be a single formula, as we saw. There will be different process formulas or components to it. In the internal capital adequacy assessment process, then stress testing, because each individual country's situations are different. So the risk appetite will be different, governance will be different. So there is necessary to ensure capital and liquidity buffers, and that they are adequate. So the risk assessment first will involve risk identification. For it will differ from country to country. Country risk will be sovereign credit quality, the political stability, the legal environment, how strong is the judiciary. Then cross-border exposure, the loans to the foreign entities around the nation, the trade finance, the foreign subsidiaries which are there in the country. Then sectoral sensitivity, energy, defense, commodities, technology, especially the semiconductors. So using the risk measurement tools such as the internal scoring systems and external ratings from reputed credit rating organizations, we can arrive, each bank or individual organization can arrive at the credit loss or liquidity, market volatility. Then we need to have also testing. We need to test this. It must simulate certain extreme scenarios, such as like sudden currency collapse, right? Like right now, freezing of the border payments, cross-border payments, or asset seizure. So these should be fed into the capital planning and contingencies strategies. So the risk transmission channels, so which are all the areas where we need to assess the risk? One is credit risk, market risk, credit risk because of due to sanctions or economic collapse, market risk due to depreciation, currency depreciation, commodity price stocks, then price shocks, then liquidity risk, funding disruptions, withdrawal of foreign capital, so lack of funds, operational risk, cyber warfare, disruption of the global payment systems. So we need to have a proper system of mitigation. Mitigation strategies need to be in place, which will involve certain forethinking, foresight, vision. So one would be diversification. First is diversification geographically, and also avoid concentration in the high risk regions. Certain pockets where there is constant conflicts, or where there is our political relations are not so good. Then exposure, country risk exposure. Limit your risk to limit the country wise exposure, sector specific exposures also. We need to have high capital buffers. Also, not only for this, but also cyclical, to counter the cyclical buffers. We need to have buffers. Hedging strategies, currency hedging, commodity hedging, credit derivatives. We need to manage liquidity. So we have a liquidity coverage ratio. It's normally 100%. Diversify funding sources. We need to have a proper contingency planning. Exit strategies from high risk countries. We need to have an alternative supply or payment routes if a particular currency goes out of circulation. We need to have crisis management protocols. Then whenever there are sanctions, compliance framework. See, monitor those sanctions and have strong KYC and anti-money laundering controls. We have softwares for that. Governance and oversight. We need to have a board level involvement in this. We cannot afford to have the LI. We need to have a board level involvement. We cannot afford to have situations like the LIC, where a huge amount of money, which is actually the hard earned savings of millions of Indian population, has been invested in another company. So there should be proper risk assessment involved there, taking into account the risk appetite. Then senior management should be implementing the monitoring systems and ensure the stress test. Risk committees should be in place to evaluate and integrate the geopolitical risk into the enterprise risk. So in totality, when we look at the risk management, we should look into all these three pillars. The pillar one, where the minimum capital requirement is there, depending upon the credit, market, and operational risks. The second pillar of the supervisory review, which is where the core areas of geopolitical risk, and also address the capital adequacy and stress testing. And pillar 3 for disclosures, transparency on countries' exposures and the risks involved. So, geopolitical risk reflects the macro level imbalance of power, resources, and ideologies. So, to build strong banks, we need to have a resilience that is which is based on which will have capital plus liquidity and an awareness of the watch out for the early signals where which will require provisioning, not this last moment fund creation, and adaptability, contingency planning should be there. So we have had instances in the past where geopolitical situations has called for providing for additional capital in order to bear that risks involved. But right now, I have just got two case studies, one involving China and the other involving Russia, but then we'll take it at some other time. But right now, what I was talking, what I wanted to bring out was we need to have a proper credit risk assessment kind of a questionnaire or assessment method where proper which will involve globalization in reversing the regional blocks, supply chain, which is another major risk vector, then technical sectors, which is again geopolitical. So we, on that basis, we can have a proper mitigation mitigation plan. So the risk assessment channels will cover market risk, credit risk, liquidity risk, operational risk. And for that, we can provide weightages depending upon our past experience and various other factors. Now, for example, if you want to create a scorecard, let us take 6 core dimensions. The political stability, which covers governance and the regime risk, for which a weightage of 20% may be given. For economic strength, the macro resilience, a 15% weightage. External relations, sanctions, diplomacy, 15%. Security risk for conflicts and terrorism, terrorist attacks and such things, so 20%. Financial risk, financial system risk like banking and currency stability, for that 15%, and supply chain exposure for the trade and logistics vulnerability, we can provide another 15%. So based on these weightages, a proper scoring system can be devised, an internal scoring card, and then we can have a standardized scoring scale of 1 to 5, which means where 1 is very low risk, 2 is low risk, 3 is moderate risk, 4 is high risk, and 5 is severe risk. So based on this, this scorecard will transform geopolitics into a measurable intelligence, actionable strategy, and a decision system that can be repeated again and again. So, in a way, what we need to bring about is an order when there is global uncertainty, translating chaos into clarity and conscious action. So, I hope you enjoyed this talk on risk management. I would love to have your feedbacks. Thank you.